Hello and welcome to Bitawd. Ethiopian importers spent years learning a particular kind of patience. You sign the contract, you have the birr, the bank accepts your application, and then you wait months for dollars that may never arrive. It looks like a banking problem or a paperwork problem. It is neither. A country runs out of foreign currency slowly, and in public, in a table that anyone can read. Every dollar that enters or leaves Ethiopia is written down in that table, and it is called the balance of payments. The balance of payments is one country's account with the rest of the world, every dollar in, every dollar out across a single year. And it has one strange property that most explanations rush past. It always balances. Not usually, not in a good year. Always, because it is an accounting identity like your own spending, which must equal what you earned plus whatever you borrowed. But it balances partly by construction, because when the measured flows refuse to add up, the difference is booked to a line called errors and omissions. That line is not a type of transaction. It is simply whatever is left over. And the gaps come from ordinary things. A shipment counted in one year but paid for in the next, or a transaction that nobody recorded at all. Values get converted at different exchange rates, sources disagree with one another, and plenty of figures are estimated rather than properly counted. None of that is fraud, and it is not incompetence either. It is what happens when you try to measure every single transaction between one country and the whole world. And Ethiopia has a source of its own that matters more than any of those. For years, a great deal of remittance money and foreign currency dealing has happened outside the banking system, in the parallel market, where nobody records it. So an import can be recorded properly, while the dollars that actually paid for it never appear in the official numbers at all. That difference has to land somewhere, and this is where it lands. That picture is improving, though, because more of those transfers are now arriving through official channels, and the National Bank has been working to close the gap. So the identity holding tells you the arithmetic worked, not that the country is fine. Every figure that follows comes from the National Bank of Ethiopia's most recent annual report, published in July 2026. Begin where most people picture trade beginning, which is goods. Ethiopia sold $8.3 billion abroad last year, and bought $18.8 billion, which leaves a trade gap of $10.4 billion. Three other lines push back against that gap, and all three are measured net, what came in minus what went out. Services earned $8.2 billion gross, mostly Ethiopian airlines carrying other people's passengers and cargo, but Ethiopia buys services abroad too, so the net contribution is $1.3 billion. Ethiopians living abroad sent home a net $7 billion, which is the largest single positive line in the whole account. And official transfers, meaning grants, added $1.8 billion. Put those three against the trade gap, and the current account comes to minus $289 million. So the country was short by $289 million, and that shortfall has to be met from somewhere. Notice what was not in that list: borrowing and foreign investment. Grants count as earnings because nobody has to pay them back. A loan or an investment is different because it arrives now and creates an obligation later, so it sits in a separate account entirely. That account is what actually finances the gap, and it leaves only three options. Foreigners invest, the government borrows, or the country runs down its own reserves. The first two are financing. The third is a country spending its savings. A foreign currency crisis is not what happens when the gap opens. It is what happens when the financing stops turning up. Investors grow nervous and stop putting money in, and a loan that used to roll over quietly now has to be repaid in hard currency. The gap does not close because the money to fill it vanished, so reserves take the weight and begin to fall. And here it stops being accounting and becomes law. Ethiopia's central bank proclamation, passed in February 2025, requires the national bank to hold reserves sufficient to cover short-term imports, foreign debt commitments, and basic services. If those reserves fall, or even look likely to, the governor must report to the board. And where the situation persists, the proclamation says the governor may decline to issue further foreign exchange permits. That is a safeguard rather than a forecast, but it does show you what the pressure eventually reaches. The queue at the bank, the importer told to wait, the letter of credit that takes months. That is what a shortage looks like from the counter. So now look at what those same accounts did last year. In the year to July 2024, the current account deficit was $6.2 billion. 1 year later, that same deficit was just $289 million. It did not narrow, it very nearly disappeared. Exports more than doubled, though most of that was gold, where volumes rose more than eightfold and gold went from about 11% of export earnings to nearly 42%. Add foreign investment of about $4 billion, and the overall balance swung from minus $1.3 billion to plus $2.8 billion. So the balancing line changed direction, and reserves were built instead of drained. And more than half of that build, about $1.5 billion, accumulated at commercial banks rather than at the central bank. None of that came out of nowhere. In July 2024, Ethiopia changed its foreign exchange regime and let the birr be set by the market. At the end of July 2023, a dollar cost about 55 birr, a year later about 58, and by the end of July 2025, it cost roughly 135. That is more than half the birr's value, gone inside a single year. And a market rate does two things at once. It pulls that parallel trade into the official system, and it pays exporters and the people sending money home a real price for their dollars. Much of the improvement we just walked through comes from exactly that. Which brings the residual back. Errors and omissions came to minus $2.2 billion, and the National Bank puts that down to a timing lag in processing gold exports into its reserves. So the same gold that drove the export boom is the gold the accounts could not yet place. In both previous years, that line was positive and far smaller. The turnaround is real, but it is approximate. The balance of payments is a map, not a photograph. So the next time you read that reserves have fallen, or that the birr has moved again, you know where to look. Not at one dramatic number, but at a ledger with two sides that must come level, and at which line is doing the balancing. The balance of payments does not predict a currency crisis. It shows you the pressures that could become one, published every single year, long before any of it reaches the exchange rate. A currency crisis rarely begins on the day the currency breaks. It begins in the accounts years earlier, while everyone is still watching the rate. See you on the next deep dive.